The year was 1766, and he provided the world with a theory of capital investment that resonates today. Turgot was among the first economists to understand and prove that accumulated savings are the true engine of economic growth, not land and labor. In his Reflections on the Formation and Distribution of Wealth, published in 1766, Turgot explained how capitalists pay wages and resources to workers before production yields any return, and that the rate of interest is determined by the supply and demand for capital. What was this venture? Who were its leaders? The chief executive officer was George Washington, commander of the Continental Army. The chief financial officer was Robert Morris, the financier for the Continental Congress. But the Continental scrip eventually had become worthless. There was no trust in its conversion to goods and service. The United States Congress was broke. Welcome back to the Moneyball Method Podcast. My name is Mark Shupe, the author of the Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing, and I'd like to pick up again where we left off last week, and that is moving backward in time and talking a little bit about the history of money and the history of venture capital. And today I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about a couple of economists, one of whom you've never heard of. And then at the end of my podcast, I want to introduce someone who I believe to be the greatest venture capitalist in the history of the world. One of the goals of these podcasts is to relate economic principles to your personal financial experience and quality of life. To that end, I have introduced more than 20 individuals who are not well known, but who are the unsung heroes of Western civilization because of their inventions and their investments. I ended last week's podcast with a discussion of Say's law of markets as the foundational principle for all economic theory. In other words, supply creates its own demand. Jean-Baptiste Say was a student of Adam Smith, of Scottish Enlightenment fame. But besides Smith, I will introduce one other economist from the 1700s that you probably have not heard of, and I will conclude this podcast with the greatest venture capital that I mentioned earlier. His name is Haym Salomon, the banker behind the most risky, most radical, and most productive angel financing deal imaginable. And to bring all of that home, I will quote a 2026 Substack article titled Money as the Visible Form of Productivity. It was written by Xenia Iano, and you have heard me say many times, money is production and production is money. Xenia's article does a great job expanding on that theme. The first economist, the one you've never heard of, is a French classical economist by the name of Jacques Turgot. The year was 1766, and he provided the world with a theory of capital investment that resonates today. Turgot was among the first economists to understand and prove that accumulated savings are the true engine of economic growth, not land and labor. In his Reflections on the Formation and Distribution of Wealth, published in 1766, Turgot explained how capitalists pay wages and resources to workers before production yields any return, and that the rate of interest is determined by the supply and demand for capital. This was a time when usury on loans was still considered taboo in many parts of the world, and yet not only were loans considered property, but the interest on loans were now treated as property. And how does that relate to how you perceive money today? According to Xenia's article, a human life is not lived in the abstract. It is lived here on earth in material reality through action. The state of your finances is not the whole of your values, but it does flow from achieving your goals. The second thing that was developed, discovered, introduced by Jacques Turgot was the law of diminishing returns. This is a fundamental principle of economics, that adding one more input to a fixed input will eventually deliver less additional output. Specifically in agriculture, Turgot noted that successive applications to a plot of land would produce progressively less grain. And getting back to money as production, we survive by reason, by purposeful action, by transforming the environment to support life. To live as a human being is to think, produce, choose, create, maintain, build, repair, and trade. The third and last aspect of Turgot's economic work is free market liberalism and the attack on mercantilism. As finance minister under Louis XVI, Jacques Turgot was a fierce advocate for free markets and economic liberty. You've heard about that a lot on my podcast. He opposed guilds, trade monopolies, and government regulation of grain prices. Turgot argued that interventions distort natural market prices and they impoverish nations. Think about that in today's context. Wealth flows naturally when individuals are free to pursue their own economic interests. And getting back to money as productive reality, the honest point is not that money directly injects happiness into the soul. The point is that both happiness and wealth can arise from the same root, the successful exercise of reason in the service of life. But this is the year 2026, meaning the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Also published in the year 1776 was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And I'd like to discuss 5 economic themes that Adam Smith made famous and that we take for granted for today, at least those of us who believe in political liberty and economic freedom. The first was the power of the division of labor. Smith opened his book with a famous pin factory example to show that specialized tasks dramatically increase output and efficiency. The broader lesson is that specialization, whether among workers or firms or nations, is the engine of economic growth and rising living standards. This kind of cooperation allows people to accomplish far more than isolated self-sufficiency ever could. And what does Xenia say about that? Money expands action. It buys time, space, safety, tools, options, and the capacity to pursue higher values. It reduces the constant pressure of survival. It gives a person room to think beyond next week. That does not guarantee wisdom or joy, but it undeniably changes the terms on which life is lived. The second economic concept from Adam Smith is markets coordinate through the price system, also known as the invisible hand. Individuals pursuing their own self-interest will promote the general welfare without that intention. The key is prices. They transmit information and coordinate the decisions of millions of strangers without central direction. This insight underlies the elegance of market economies and is the most profound idea in all social sciences. Regarding money as production, in a free exchange, money is not just currency, it is value made visible. It is a material expression of the fact that a person has thought, acted, produced, and offered something that others judged worth trading for. The third theme from Adam Smith: the source of wealth is productive labor, not accumulated gold. Adam Smith attacked the dominant view that national wealth meant stockpiling gold and silver through trade surpluses. Trade surpluses and deficits don't really matter. He argued that the true wealth of a nation is the productive capacity of its people and the goods and services they create. This reframing fundamentally changed how economists and statesmen thought about prosperity. And as Xenia wrote, money is what happens when thought works. Money is what happens when effort becomes value. Money is what happens when competence meets reality and reality answers back. Back to the Substack article, a person who is productive, self-supporting, and building values in the world tends to experience something that dependency cannot provide: the knowledge that they can make life happen. That is the Moneyball Method, taking ownership of your future. And the last theme from Adam Smith that I'd like to discuss today is beware of the collusion of merchants and governments. One of Adam Smith's most underappreciated lessons is the deep skepticism of business interests capturing political power. I call it regulatory capture. He warned repeatedly that merchants and manufacturers who conspire to lobby governments for monopoly power and protections will suppress the free flow of capital. Remember, there are no natural monopolies, only those that are mandated and enforced by government. True market competition requires guarding against this kind of rent seeking, making Smith not simply a cheerleader for business, but a rigorous critic of corporate cronyism. As Xenia comments, the issue is authorship. Did you build the values that sustain your life? Did you create, earn, choose, maintain, and direct them? Are you living as a casual agent or as a passive recipient? This is where happiness lies. But what I'd like to do now is turn this over to an individual, a man that I believe might be the greatest venture capitalist in the history of the world. His name was Haim Salomon. What enterprise did he invest in? America. America was a startup enterprise. Think of it that way. Its business plan was the Declaration of Independence. The executive summary began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Self-evident implies reason and reality. Equality respects the natural right of everyone to keep what they earn. And the pursuit of happiness is those chosen values. Or as Xenia said, money cannot make you happy, but happiness can make you money, and the process of earning money can reinforce the cause of happiness. A happy person is one whose mind is functioning well, whose values are integrated, whose effort is purposeful, whose self-trust is intact. Trust, that is a theme we're going to talk about a little bit more in this podcast. But that is the purpose and the benefit of independence. The second point regarding Haim Salomon, what was this venture? Who were its leaders? The chief executive officer was George Washington, commander of the Continental Army. The chief financial officer was Robert Morris, the financier for the Continental Congress. But the Continental scrip money eventually had become worthless. There was no trust in its conversion to goods and services. The United States Congress was broke. The soldiers were not getting paid. Washington needed hard currency. Haim Salomon was the venture capitalist who rounded up the investors, raised the capital, converted it to hard currency, and paid the bills that won the Battle of Yorktown. This was the decisive battle of the Revolutionary War in 1782. How did he do this? For one thing, he spoke their language. He was fluent in several European languages, literally. And second, he was extraordinarily competent. Third, regarding businesses and running out of money, as Forbes and Real Clear Markets journalist John Tamney has taught me, businesses do not run out of money. They run out of trust. Haim Salomon was a Jewish immigrant from Poland who had earned the trust of Washington, Morris, and the governments of France, Holland, and Spain. Benjamin Franklin was his venture capital partner in France. But specifically, what did Haim Salomon do? Where did the money come from? Salomon and Franklin negotiated loans with foreign governments. Those governments issued bills of exchange. In other words, bonds, paper. Bonds payable by those governments because the Continental Congress had no credit. Holland, France, and Spain had credit. They were willing to invest in America, at least in part, just to weaken their enemy, Great Britain. But what did Salomon do with this paper from France, Holland, and Spain? He sold these foreign government bonds to American merchants and bankers. And they paid for those bonds with hard money coin, specie as they called it. So essentially, the financiers of the venture capital. The investors, rounded up by venture capitalist Haym Salomon, were American merchants and bankers giving hard money in exchange for foreign paper because they believed in the Declaration of Independence, they believed in political liberty and economic freedom, and they were willing to take that risk. This is essential. This is primary. It is American merchants and bankers who bought the bonds and financed the revolution because they're willing to risk their earned wealth for the cause of liberty, but they needed to trust that a society of contract was backing them. Those contracts were the bills of exchange. The Continental Congress had not yet earned that trust, but Washington, Franklin, and the Declaration of Independence were the enterprise that were worth that risk. With hard money, Washington was able to pay the French soldiers, feed them, and pay American soldiers in real gold and silver coin that had been issued by France and Spain in many cases. It was money they could trust. America won the decisive battle at Yorktown. Capitalism was given a chance for the first time in world history, and the American dollar eventually became the world's most reliable form of money because the American economy is the most productive economy in the history of the world. But there's more to the story of Haym Salomon. As told by My Jewish Learning, in the wake of a fire that destroyed much of New York City early during the American Revolution, British occupation forces arrested and imprisoned Salomon. He gained release because the British hoped to use his language skills to communicate with their German mercenaries. Instead, Salomon covertly encouraged the Hessians to desert. Arrested again in early 1778 for espionage and sabotage, Salomon had his property confiscated. A drumhead court-martial sentenced him to hang, but Salomon escaped, probably with the help of the Sons of Liberty. There's a lot more to the story of Haym Salomon, a Jewish immigrant from Poland who was fluent in several languages, but who became, in my opinion, the greatest venture capitalist in the history of the world, financing that fledgling enterprise known as the United States of America. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found this fun and educational, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.